Let's review the Ribaldo from LK Chen developed with me. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. Now, although I developed this with LK Chen, this is going to be a completely neutral review, and I do have some constructive comments to make about this sword. I'm not just going to tell you that it's perfect, but nevertheless, how did this come about? Well, quite simply, as you know, I study medieval swords, and I know lots of other people who do as well, and one of those people is Clive Thomas. Now, Clive Thomas has written a bunch of articles for various publications, but including the Park Lane Arms Fair catalogue, which was really a journal, an arms and armour journal. And Clive is a friend of mine, and I have access to those journals. Unfortunately, they are no more because the Park Lane Arms Fair stopped. But what he did in a bunch of his articles was provide very detailed measurements of a whole bunch of swords. So what I did is I went with those measurements to LK Chen and said, you know, looking at the Jian and other swords that you make, I think you could make a really good early side sword, which is what this is. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And, you know, we had some back and forth. I shared the measurements. I got additional photos of the sword, which was sold in auction. And we played around with the statistics and the measurements a little bit because some of the photos looked a little bit deceptive because of the angles they were taken from. We went through a prototype stage. This down here is the first prototype, which required a few changes to it. And finally, we ended up with this, the Ribaldo, which was named by me with some help from Augusto Bourbrunt as well. So thanks to him. And essentially this is in full production now. It's fully available through the LK Chen website. It's also available on certain other resellers' websites as well in the UK, the US and elsewhere. So this is widely available and has been for a few months now. Now, I could have done a review a little bit earlier on. For various reasons I decided not to. The sword is, the original anyway, is from the Alexandria arsenal, and it's actually dated. It probably, it dates dated when it comes into the arsenal because it has Arabic text. So the Alexandria arsenal was a Mamluk repository for swords and other weapons as well, arms and armour. And essentially they were things that were either given in tribute or payment to the Mamluks, or they were captured in battle by the Mamluks, or perhaps other various ways that they entered the state arsenal. But when they entered the state arsenal, they were dated, which is absolutely amazing for historians of medieval swords, because it means that we know what date these swords entered that arsenal. Now, it doesn't mean that that's the date of manufacture of the sword. So obviously something could be made 10 years before, could be made 1 year before, and end up going into the arsenal and being dated at that point. The estimation is that this sword was probably made around 1420, 1415 perhaps. So around the time of the Battle of Agincourt and around the time of Fiore de Liberi's treaties, for example. But the most noticeable thing you'll immediately notice about it is that fingering. So let's dispense with the scabbard for a second. So these fingerings first start to appear on Spanish and Italian swords at the beginning, well actually at the end of the 14th century. The earliest known example that I can remember off the top of my head is from around 1395, thereabouts, 1396 maybe. So in art they appear in the 1390s, which is insanely early really for the beginnings of complex hilts. And bear in mind that these fingerings and coupled perhaps with knuckle bows are the first elements of what later on evolved to be side swords, rapiers and so on and so forth. So these fingerings first start to appear in what we could call southern Europe or southwestern Europe, so Italy and Spain or the Iberian Peninsula, at the end of the 14th century, but we actually have surviving dated examples from the Alexandria arsenal. From the earliest one that I'm aware of is the one in the Royal Armouries, which is similar to this but rather different proportions, lighter and smaller sword, and that is dated to around 1415-16 if I remember correctly. So that's about the earliest surviving examples we've got. Now, what's important to note is that a lot of people would just refer to this in the modern world as a side sword. However, Sidesword isn't a historical term, it's a modern curator's term, and in the context of the time this would just simply be called a sword, and really it's just an arming sword. So it's a one-handed medieval sword which happens to have a finger ring on it. Now there is another tendency for these, and that is that a lot of them, in fact most of them, have an oakshot type 19 blade, which is characterised by this blunt ricasso at the bottom, which of course suits perfectly putting your finger over the guard. Now, we do find type 19 blades on arming swords which don't have finger rings as well. And in fact, it's probable that in period these were more common, and that as people more frequently started putting their fingers over the front of the guard, the front quillon, that they started more frequently adding finger rings like this one here to protect the finger from a blade sliding down. And this is the beginning of the side sword, but bear in mind this is very early in the side sword's history, so that apart from the fact that it's an oakshot type 19 blade and it's got a finger ring, in every other practical way it's essentially a medieval one-handed sword. It's like a knightly arming sword, but remember of course that knights on the battlefield would at this time be wearing gauntlets, and you can't put a gauntleted finger through that finger ring, it won't fit. The finger ring's too small. Moreover, you don't need a finger ring if you've got gauntlets on. So these seem to be indicative of soldiers who wouldn't be wearing gauntlets. Now that could be lightly equipped skirmishers, light cavalry, it could be crossbowmen and archers, people like this, certain types of mercenary. So the fact is that this is not necessarily a battlefield knightly sword, but it could be the sword that maybe a knight would carry in civilian life. So this equally, as well as being perhaps for lighter equipped soldiers, could also, hence the name Ribaldo, which refers to skirmishers, or this could be the sword of a person in civilian life. So for example, they might carry a normal arming sword or a long sword on the battlefield, or wear one, but this is the sword they might carry in civilian life and use with a buckler. And it's no coincidence that by the time we get to the time of Marozzo and Manciolino writing their treatises with sword and buckler, we see the finger pretty much universally over the guard and finger rings there to protect the finger. Now it's important to note that this is quite a beast of a sword. This is about a 36.5-inch blade, 92.5 centimeters I think. This is a long blade for a one-handed sword, and it's quite broad as well, but it has very good distal taper. And because we were working strictly to the measurements provided by Clive Thomas and published in the Park Lane Arms Fair Journal, this has the same distal taper as the original. So you will notice, and I'm being careful with this because it is a sharp blade, if I flex it, it flexes entirely in the second half of the blade, because the blade is fairly thick at the base and obviously tapers down to being really quite thin. So despite the fact that this is a very long blade and quite a broad blade, it's relatively quick at the tip and relatively manoeuvrable, which you'll also notice in the context of the time is a blade that's much more suited to hitting soft targets, clothed targets, rather than armoured targets. This is not a sword that would be hugely effective against people in armour, because although it is obviously pointy, it's a very thin and comparatively fragile point. It's not a reinforced point, it's not a particularly acute point. So while you can still cut very effectively out towards the tip with this sword, it is not going to be effective at thrusting through thick padding, or indeed mail, aka chainmail. There are better swords around at this time for that. So this is a sword, again, which is not just in the hilt design, but also in the blade design, better suited to light skirmishers, lightly equipped soldiers fighting other lightly equipped soldiers, or civilians who are dueling in the streets of Italy. That being said, the size and mass and feel of this sword is beefy, it's big, so it's unlike some of the later period side swords, which are getting a little bit narrower, a little bit more acutely tipped, moving towards rapiers essentially, and becoming really quite quick and light weapons in the hand. This, whilst it is quick for its proportions, is a pretty beefy sword and can deal out some whopping cuts, which we'll see a little bit later in this video. So this is almost like the bastard love child halfway between a earlier period medieval arming sword and a later period sort of civilian side sword. It's somewhere in between. It's not a typical side sword in any sense. This, I can't overstate how big and imposing this blade is at 36.5 inches, or almost 30, just under 36.5 inches. This is a really big, really serious blade that can deal some phenomenal cuts, even quite out towards the tip here, because of that very thin cross section and relatively broad blade. Another detail to note about this sword is the fairly large but also fairly thin disc or wheel pommel. And this is completely true to the original. It's the true thickness, it's the true size, it's an exact replica, and it is really, really very thin. So it does, if you put your hand down, slide past the hand quite easily. However, the other thing to note about the sword is it has a relatively long grip compared to normal side swords. So normally a side sword only has enough grip for you to fit 3 or 4 fingers on. In this case, if you've got the finger over the fingering, you only need space for 3 fingers. But this has an extra bit of grip at the bottom. Now, there has been some discussion about this amongst various people I know. Why is the grip that much longer? You could say it's partly to aid balance and make the sword, because it is a big blade, to help balance out the sword. Another possibility is that upon occasion you could bring up the left hand, and you can, if you grip 2 fingers above the pommel, you can use this as a bastard sword as well. So in one sense, maybe this is a bastard sword, which is possible, because if we look at some of the Bolognese sources, Anonimo, for example, does mention using a one-handed sword that you occasionally grip with two hands, so that could be true here. Or it could simply be for balance and potentially for hooking, disarms, arm manipulations, things like this as well, a bit like a Langmesser. But either way, it's worth noting that this longer hilt is not typical of side swords, but is quite typical of arming swords of this period. Now, because we're all fans of distal taper on this channel, and I know you like these kind of stats, I've got my calipers here, and I'm just going to give you an idea of what this blade starts at, just over 5 millimeters, 5.1 millimeters, and the ricasso maintains that width here, thickness rather. Stays 5 millimeters, move about 12 inches up the blade, it's down to 4.5, move about 2 feet up the blade, it's down to 3, move up within about a foot of the point, it's 2.8, and up near the point, a few centimeters down from the point, it's 1.8. So you can see it's got quite considerable distal taper. It doesn't start incredibly thick. There are certainly medieval swords which start a lot thicker than that, up to a centimetre. However, bear in mind this is a one-handed sword, so it's not fair to compare with long swords. It's a one-handed sword, and it's fairly broad. Okay, so 5 millimeters down through 4.5, down to about 3, down to 1.8 near the tip. So quite a hell of a lot of distal taper on this, which gives it, despite the fact that it's a very long blade and it's broad, gives it quite a lively feeling, as mentioned. So now my concise review. How well did LK Chen do? At the end of the day, what I provided was the stats, which Clive Thomas had actually recorded, but I shared the stats, I shared additional photos of the original sword, which I managed to get hold of, and I basically gave feedback to the prototype stage, and what you end up with in your hand is has had some of my input into it. So it wasn't like I designed this sword, okay? So if there's something, and this actually comes up in quite a few of my reviews, if there's something you don't like about the design of this sword, take your issue up with the 15th century, early 15th century Italian maker. I didn't design this sword, I didn't choose every aspect of it. This is a replica, okay? This is a replica of a genuine surviving sword from the Alexandria arsenal, which is one of probably the 2 or 3 most important collections of medieval swords that have survived to modern times. Okay, so I believed it was important to create a true replica of that artifact, and then see how it performs, see what it does, see what it can teach us, okay? Now, how have LK Chen done? Pretty well, okay? It's not perfect, but it's pretty damn good, and I think very good value for the price point. It's as close as many replicas at a higher price point are, okay? So, things that they got good, the proportions. They matched the distal taper absolutely correctly. They matched the proportions of the hilt it's quite a small finger ring, so a lot of people out there will be used to quite considerably larger finger rings on later period swords. But note, on these early side swords, if you want to call them that, but early arming swords with a finger ring, the finger rings are small. And I think the implication is you only stick the tip of the finger through. You don't try and put the whole finger over the crossguard. You just insert the tip. Having done that, the finger ring's perfectly big enough, so long as you don't try and stick more finger through. But if you're used to sticking more finger in, then you will find this finger ring small. But that's like the original. The original is that size. The crossguard looks somewhat short for the proportions of the sword, but so is the original. So the crossguard and the finger ring are modelled on the original, and they tell us interesting things about the sword. The pommel is rather featureless and flat, but so is the original. It has very slight doming to it, so it's not completely flat. It actually rises up in the centre slightly and thins down at the edges. Okay, and that's exactly true to the replica and the original. So they did a great job. The grip we had to guess, because the grip was missing on the original one. In fact, the first grip on the prototype we weren't really happy with. It was a bit too fat, so we slimmed it down on the subsequent one. The shaping of the grip is great. It's oval. It meets the guard and the pommel here without overlap. And then I think it's the correct sort of width here. So that gives really good edge alignment. Even if you don't put your finger through the finger ring, if you don't like the finger ring and just hold it like a normal arming sword, it gives really, really good indexing and edge alignment in the hand. So good stuff. Before I go on to the blade, one thing, constructive thing, that I'm not a big fan of with LK Chen's hilt is the corners are not rounded enough, okay? And this is especially important, and I have told LK Chen this. This is especially important when you're dealing with a sword that has a interaction between your hand and the weapon, and that is especially true when you've got a finger ring. So whilst it's not sharp exactly, and it is a bit rounded, and this is more rounded than the prototype was, I do feel that these corners and these points and edges could do to be a little bit more smoothed off, a little bit more finished, a little bit more rounded. Obviously you could do that yourself, but it's better if the manufacturer does that before it leaves the factory. So it's not sharp, like I say, it's not going to scratch me, although those points might do. It could just do with a little bit more polish to these edges and corners. And the same is true of the pommel. The pommel edges around here are just a little bit too angular, I think, for comfortable interaction between the hand and the pommel. The grip's fantastic. The grip is genuine leather, and I will tell you that dealing with Chinese manufacturers, getting them to use genuine leather is not easy. By standard, all manufacturing in China these days uses artificial leather, and that's what they're familiar with. That's what they can get hold of easily. It is not difficult, it's not easy rather, to get them to work with real leather, but after some persuasion and experiments, they conceded that real leather was the way to go for this grip. It's cord bound over wood with risers at top and bottom as I specified, and I chose, because I chose this grip essentially, I specified everything to do with this grip because there's no grip on the original sword, and it's executed really, really well. The seam is pretty smooth. There's a tiny bit of lifting there, which could maybe be dealt with, but overall, given that they'd not really done this type of grip before on a sword, I was quite impressed with what they did. It's not up to the same standard as other manufacturers who've got more experience with these grips, but it's pretty good and probably equal to most medieval swords. So there's my constructive feedback for the hilt. I will also mention, full disclosure, the original prototype I got, there was a very tiny bit of play in the pommel. It wasn't peened totally solidly, and also the peen was a bit rough. They have improved the peen, and this one is totally solid. But when you get yours, do check that that's solid, do check that the peen is satisfactory. Right, on to the blade. So the reason I decided to work with LK Chen on this particular sword is most sword manufacturers would struggle with this blade. It's got a lot of distal taper and is very thin up here, and is a relatively complex blade section because it goes from rectangular to hexagonal with a fuller to hexagonal without a fuller to sort of lenticular. Okay, so it's got some quite complex and advanced blade geometry going up the blade. Did LK Chen do a good job? Yes, they did a good job. Is there room for improvement? yes, there's room for improvement. Right, so first things first, the ricasso I was happy with, and you'll notice it also has this detailing which we decided to highlight with black just to make it stand out more, but that could be removed. They did that really, really well. They did the decoration well, they did the fuller well, and nice and straight, nicely finished, all that kind of stuff. I have one criticism of the ricasso, and again you might find this on lots of medieval swords, but I'd rather not find it on my replicas, to be honest. So you will notice that the plunge grinds here, for where we go from the ricasso to the edge, are slightly higher on this side than on this side, and that's a bit disappointing. I would like to see the grinds on both sides being completely at the same height rather than one being slightly higher than the other. That's the first criticism. The second criticism is they're also not quite at the same height here. So they're slightly higher, the plunge grinds slightly higher on that side than that side. They've ground further down here. This side is actually pretty even on both sides. So I would say more care and attention needs to be paid to the level of the grinds relative to each edge, and also relative to each side of each edge as well. That's the first thing. In terms of the edge geometry, absolutely fantastic, no criticism whatsoever. This is why I went to LK Chen. LK Chen are fantastic at doing a direct grind straight down to the edge. So there is a single bevel to the edge down here, and it is sharp. I do not want to apply pressure and run my fingers along that. You can feel how sharp it is. It's very slightly apple-seeded, which is fine. That adds a bit of strength behind the edge. It transitions the fuller goes to exactly the same place on both sides. I'm happy with that. Then when we go into the straight hexagonal section and the lenticular section, I do have one more piece of constructive feedback, and this is not a small thing actually. So where we've got a rectangle, no problem at all. When we move into a hexagonal, so you imagine you've got on each side you've got a flat, then you've got a bevel, then you've got a bevel, then you've got a flat. Okay, hexagon. Where the flat meets the bevel, I would like to see that line a little bit more defined. At the moment it's a little bit rounded out, and I suspect this has happened in polishing. So I suspect they were ground very defined and then they've been smoothed out in polishing. So if you look along the blade, yes indeed I can see one half of a hexagon on each side. So bevel, flat, bevel, but where the flat meets the bevel, it's not as sharp and defined as I was hoping for. I was a little bit disappointed by that. When it goes into lenticular, no problem at all, pretty much flat up here. So that's no problem, that's easy, that's one of the easiest grinds to do. So I'd like to see more definition of the hexagonal section, if possible. But the edges are formidable, and we're going to have a look at what they do in a second. The only final thing I would say about the blade before we go and have a look at some cutting is looking along it, everything looks pretty straight. There is a tiny bit of a meander in the fuller, but I wouldn't really complain about it. It's pretty close to perfect. And looking along the blade, there is some rippling, as there pretty much always is as there is usually with original medieval swords. The rippling is minimal and doesn't bother me in the least. It's the level of rippling, whilst it's there, it's not completely 100% flat. The rippling is completely equivalent to antique swords that I own. So I don't have a problem with that, and really you only notice it if you look for it. You can't see the rippling if you look flat at the blade. You can only see a tiny bit of rippling if you look along the blade. Final thing we're going to look at before we go into some cutting is the scabbard. So I'll just grab the prototype scabbard for a second. So the scabbard was never intended to be anything particularly special. It was essentially a bonus, an extra, because especially with sharp swords, I've always believed they should be provided with at least a storage scabbard. Now this is a wood cord, leather covered, and I'll talk about that in a second, stitched at the back scabbard of basic quality with a bronze chape at the end. Now, some constructive feedback for this. The stitching is a little bit crude and a little bit big. The stitching could be done better. The leather is not leather, it's artificial leather as far as I can tell, and it looks artificial. It's too shiny. and it doesn't look great. So honestly, this is a scabbard that you're probably going to think looks a bit cheap, and it does. But it will do the job, and if you want to upgrade it, you can take this off or cover it with real leather and put your belt attachments and such like on. And these little flaps up here, I think, you know, they look a little bit thin and cheap, and the stitching on them is a bit crude. The shape is rather basic and not great quality, and I should mention, and unfortunately this is a factor with quite a few LK Chen products I have had, the glue gives out. So these are literally just glued on with a couple of blobs of glue either side. And unfortunately, coming from China to the United Kingdom, the atmospheric changes mean that the scabbard fittings, and it's the same with some of the other LK Chen swords, unfortunately come unstuck. It's not a big problem to glue it back on or to crimp it or to put little nails in it, but you know, just so you're aware and for full disclosure. So now let's go out and have a little look at what this sword actually does to some bottles. I'm going to try and do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That was the 6. I've got to admit, I'm quite happy with that. Let's try and do a thrust on the final one. There we go. See how many cuts I can get doing horizontal number 6s. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh. Gosh. No, can't do the final one. 4, not too good. Final cut, I'm just going to do some wood of about thumb thickness, I guess. It's medium fresh, no, it's probably quite dry actually. And for the sake of my finger, I'm not going to put my finger over the fingering. I'm going to grip it with all fingers around the grip. Wow. Pretty damned clean. I mean, it's split halfway through, but if I push those two halves back together, you can see that's a pretty clean cut. Pretty happy. So to sum up, this is the Ribaldo from LK Chen, developed by me with LK Chen, sold currently directly from LK Chen and from resellers around the world. Comes with a scabbard. As you've seen in this video, I've been completely upfront about my constructive feedback. There are some things which I would like to see improved on it, but this isn't something that comes out of my head. This isn't a made-up sword. This is purely based on a historical original from the very important assemblage of swords from Alexandria. The original still surviving, and the measurements taken by Clive Thomas accurately from the original. And it's a fascinating sword. To some people it will be an arming sword, to some people it will be a side sword, but it's kind of not one or the other. It's really at the beginning of the side sword process. It tells the beginning of the story of what leads into side swords and rapiers later on. Some would argue it's a specialised civilian dueling sword with its broad, thin blade that cuts far from the hand, 36.5-inch blade, massive. But all I can tell you is that to use, it's really, really nice to cut with. It cuts phenomenally, and as we expect from LK Chen, they make really good sharp cutting swords. Highly recommend them, and they've done a good job with this. I think, as I say, there's still some improvements that can be made to make this exactly to my vision, but they've got pretty damn close, and you know what, I think it's a very, very good value sword for what you get for the price. Very difficult to beat, and really how many other people are making an early side sword of this quality in this price category? I actually don't know anyone else at the moment. The one thing I will mention from a user perspective is that small fingering does take some getting used to if you're used to larger, later period fingerings. So as you saw there, I did not want to cut the wood with my finger through here. It is a little bit wearing on the finger, and I suspect that with these early fingerings they weren't necessarily used all the time, and if you wanted to turn this into a war sword, you would not put your finger through the fingering. Some of the time you would just grip it like that. But for dueling purposes, if we're fighting with sword and buckler, having that finger around the quillon gives you superior point control and enables you to get little snap cuts down to the leg or the forearms or places like this a little bit quicker, because it gives you an additional point of leverage. Anyway, a fascinating sword from an important assemblage, very well recreated by LK Chen, and I'm very glad that I got them to do this. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't done already, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel soon. Cheers, folks.
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.